They thought rope could hold her. High above the empty gym floor, wrists bound to the cold steel rafters, she felt the weight of every jeer, every shove, every whispered cruelty. But fear has a strange way of burning itself into resolve. That night, she learned that bonds can be more than restraints. They can be the very pressure that sharpens the blade of courage. And when she came down, she was no longer their target. She was their reckoning. They never expected the rope to fall so easily. The gymnasium of Riverton High smelled faintly of varnished wood and chalk dust. High above the polished floor, ropes hung from the steel rafters, their coarse fibers catching the light from the rows of fluorescent fixtures. A cluster of students gathered in a loose semicircle, their sneakers squeaking as they shifted for a better view. Some leaned against the padded walls, arms folded. Others whispered behind their hands. At the center of it all stood Alyssa Grant, 16 years old, her wrists bound together, the rope drawn tight and knotted above her head to the horizontal rafter. The strain had already begun to burn red bands into her skin. She was new here, new enough that she still carried the faint scent of a different life, one far from this Connecticut town and its quiet, manicured streets. Chase Whitmore stood just a step in front of her, his broad shoulders squared, his bright blue varsity jacket almost luminous under the gym lights. His smile was the kind meant to draw cameras during football season, but here it curled into something sharper. Madeline Ashford hovered to his left, auburn hair drawn into a perfect high ponytail, the red of her cheer uniform as crisp as her smirk. Brett Langston loomed nearby, hands in the pocket of his green athletic hoodie, eyes glinting with the satisfaction of a showman. They had timed this. They had chosen a moment between classes when no teacher would walk through the gym doors. And they had an audience. Alyssa did not look at the crowd. She did not plead. Her eyes stayed level, fixed somewhere just past Chase's shoulder, as though measuring something invisible in the air. The rope bit harder into her wrists as she adjusted her stance, shifting her weight slightly to her left leg. In her mind, she could still hear her father's voice, Marcus Grant, the man who believed in preparation for any circumstance. "Do not fight the rope," he had told her once. "Understand it, study its pattern, find where it gives." The voices around her wavered between mockery and discomfort. One boy near the back gave a quick laugh, too loud, as though to prove he was unbothered. A girl beside him tugged at her sleeve, whispering something that made his grin falter. Alyssa let her gaze drop for a fraction of a second, enough to take in the placement of her water bottle at the edge of the bleachers. It had been her choice to bring it in from the locker room instead of leaving it behind. The bottle's carabiner clip, a small silver hook, was already detached and hidden in her palm. She had worked it loose before Chase had finished tightening the knot above her head. The fibers of the rope were rough, but she found the twist in the cord where the tension weakened. The hook slid in, its edge pressing into the fibers. She moved slowly, her fingers steady despite the weight on her arms. Every second she kept her breathing measured, matching the rhythm she had been taught. Chase leaned closer, his voice low but meant to be heard by those nearest. "Not so tough now, are you?" She did not answer. Her eyes lifted to meet his, calm, unwavering. A strand in the rope gave way with a muted snap. The sound was small, lost beneath the hum of the gym lights, but Alyssa felt a shift in pressure instantly. She turned her wrists just enough to feed the hook into the next strand. Madeline's eyes narrowed, as though sensing something off. But before she could speak, Alyssa twisted her wrists, the last fibers parting in a sudden release. The rope slackened. Alyssa dropped. She did not fall like someone caught by surprise. Her knees bent on impact, her weight folding into the landing, the energy of the drop rolling through her body. She let her momentum carry her into a controlled step, as a gymnast would after a routine. The silence that followed was sharper than any jeer. She straightened slowly, her hands now free, the frayed end of the rope swaying above her. Her expression did not change. She looked at Chase, then at Madeline, then at Brett, not with defiance, not with triumph, but with the cool steadiness of someone who had never once doubted the outcome. A boy near the back took an involuntary step away from the circle. Someone else coughed into their sleeve. Chase's smirk had faded, replaced by something harder to name. Alyssa moved past them, her footsteps light on the polished wood. She did not rush. She did not look back. The rope dangled in her wake, slowly twisting in the air, a silent witness to what had just happened. When she reached the gym doors, she placed her hand on the cool metal bar, paused just long enough to let the quiet settle deeper into the room, and stepped through. Behind her, the rope fell the rest of the way, striking the floor with a soft thud. The rope had fallen. The gym doors had closed behind her, and still, Alyssa Grant said nothing. The hallway beyond the gym was empty, the kind of empty that amplifies every footstep. She walked without haste, her hands loose at her sides, the faint red rings around her wrists hidden beneath the cuff of her cardigan. The noise of the crowd behind her had dissolved into the muffled rhythm of her own breathing. She had learned, long before Riverton High, that silence could be a weapon. Words could be twisted, thrown back, misheard. Silence, when carried with purpose, could not be misquoted. The next period was English literature. She entered the classroom as if nothing had happened, taking her seat near the middle row. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, catching motes of chalk dust that floated in the air like suspended snow. At the front of the room stood Miss Lorraine Coleman, one of the very few black teachers at Riverton High. She wore a deep green blouse that set off the warm brown of her skin, and her hair was swept back neatly, revealing a pair of small gold earrings. She had a voice that carried easily without sharpness, a voice that made students lean in rather than shrink back. On the board, she had written in graceful script, "The Crucible, Act 2. As Alyssa settled, the door opened again. Mr. Clark, a history teacher whose voice always seemed to fill a space before he did, stepped inside without knocking. He cut across the room toward Miss Coleman, speaking over her as if the class were an afterthought. "Lorraine, I will need those photocopies for the assembly this afternoon," he said, not lowering his voice despite the students watching. "Could you make sure they are ready before lunch?" Miss Coleman's hands, which had been poised over her open lesson plan, stilled for a heartbeat. She lifted her eyes to him, her expression calm, composed. "I am in the middle of teaching, Mr. Clark," she said evenly. "Perhaps we can speak about this after class." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that was not quite apology and not quite dismissal, then turned and left without replying. A few students exchanged looks. One boy in the back made a quiet, exaggerated ooh, as if a challenge had been issued. A girl near the window giggled under her breath. Miss Coleman smoothed the corner of her notebook and began again. "Now, as I was saying," a hand shot up from the front row. Jason Miller, a senior with a habit of playing to the room, spoke without waiting to be called on. "Miss Coleman, do you think they would have burned more witches if they had, Twitter back then?" The laughter that followed was not loud, but it was knowing. Jason's eyes darted to his friends, their grins widening. Alyssa felt a slow tightening in her chest. It was not the question itself, it was the way it had been asked, the deliberate use of they, as if Miss Coleman were standing apart from history, an observer but never a participant. Miss Coleman's gaze rested on Jason for a measured moment. "The language we use matters," she said. "The way we frame the past shapes how we understand the present. Perhaps we might focus on the text before we rewrite it." Her tone was steady, but Alyssa caught the faint narrowing of her teacher's eyes, the slight lift of her chin. It was not defiance, it was dignity. The rest of the lesson unfolded without further interruption, but the tension lingered like a scent in the air. Alyssa listened closely, noting how Miss Coleman guided the discussion back to the play's themes, mob mentality, the cost of integrity, without once raising her voice. By the time the bell rang, Alyssa had decided two things. First, that Miss Coleman was not someone to be underestimated, and second, that there was power in holding one's ground without giving the other side more to twist. In the hallway, students spilled from classrooms, their voices rising in a dozen separate conversations. Alyssa kept to herself, eyes forward. A few glanced at her wrists, perhaps noticing the faint marks, but no one said anything. The day passed in a haze of movement, lockers slamming, pages turning, the muffled thud of basketballs from the gym. Yet beneath the rhythm of school life, she could feel the undercurrent, the same names at the center of every ripple: Chase, Madeline, Brett, and the quiet certainty that what had happened in the gym was not an isolated act, but part of something more deliberate. By the time the last bell released them, the winter light was already beginning to fade. Alyssa walked home along the narrow sidewalks, past houses with lights glowing in their windows, the air carrying the faint smell of wood smoke. When she stepped through her own front door, the warmth of the house wrapped around her, along with the low hum of the heating system. She closed the door quietly, setting her bag down in the hallway. Marcus Grant was at the dining table, papers spread before him in neat stacks. He looked up as she entered, his gaze moving quickly from her face to her hands, then to the sleeves of her cardigan. She felt the weight of that gaze. "Come here," he said. His voice was calm, but it carried the same edge she had heard in it during the rare moments when training had shifted from practice to real danger. She stepped closer. He reached out and took her right hand gently, turning it palm up. The cuff of her cardigan slid back, revealing the raw, reddened band around her wrist. His thumb brushed over the mark once, lightly, as if to test whether it was as deep as it looked. "Who did this?" he asked. The question was quiet, but there was nothing casual about it. Alyssa met his eyes, holding them without flinching, and she did not answer. The quiet in the dining room was heavy, the kind that filled every corner. Marcus Grant still held Alyssa's wrist in his hand, his thumb resting just above the red band. His eyes, sharp and steady, searched her face as if reading more than her silence could conceal. "Sit," he said, releasing her hand and gesturing to the chair across from him. Alyssa lowered herself into the seat. The table between them was littered with papers, neat stacks of documents, and a single black notebook open to a page of tight, deliberate handwriting. She had seen that notebook before. It was the one her father used when planning training routines, every drill broken into precise sequences. He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "We are going to walk through this. Position, time, and your response. Do not leave out anything." It was not a request. She drew in a slow breath. "The gym. Third rope from the south wall. The knot was tied above the horizontal rafter, about 7 feet up from my reach. There were 3 of them in front, Chase closest, Madeline to his left, Brett behind, and a little to the right. The others, students, were in a semicircle around us, near the bleachers. No teacher in sight. The main doors were shut." Marcus's gaze did not waver. "What time?" "Between the second and third periods. Enough time for them to be sure no one would walk in." He nodded once, the movement small. "Your reaction." Alyssa's hands rested on the table, fingers lightly touching. I stayed still, took stock of the knot. I already had the hook from my water bottle clip in my palm before Chase finished tying it. I worked it into the rope, waited for the tension to shift. When it gave, I landed soft. No damage beyond the wrists. Marcus was silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though assembling a map in his head. "And their coordination, what did you see?" "They were organized," she said, "not just in position but in timing." Brett blocked the line of sight from the bleachers. Madeline kept her eyes on the door. Chase did the talking, drawing attention to himself so no one watched my hands. She paused, the memory sharpening in her mind. It was practiced, like they had done something like this before. Marcus's jaw tightened. He tapped a finger against the table once, twice, then stopped. "You understand what that means." Alyssa met his gaze. "That it will not stop here." The heating system clicked softly in the background, a low hum filling the space between them. Marcus's face, lined from years of service and discipline, softened only slightly. "I taught you to know your exits, to use what is in your hand, to read the ground you stand on," he said. "But there is one lesson above all the rest. We win with truth, Alyssa, not with force. Force gives them the story they want. Truth leaves them nowhere to run." Her pulse steadied at his words. She understood the weight behind them, the years he had lived under the discipline of that principle. It was not the easy path. It was the patient one, the one that required precision and proof. "I know," she said quietly. Marcus studied her for a moment longer, then reached for the black notebook and closed it with deliberate care. The shrill ring of the phone cut through the air. It was not the familiar sound of the household line, but the distinct tone of the small black handset on the far end of the table. Marcus reached for it, his movements unhurried, and lifted it to his ear. "This is Grant," he said. There was a pause, then a voice on the other end, too muffled for Alyssa to catch the words, spoke rapidly. As she watched, her father's expression changed. The rigid lines of his face sharpened, his eyes narrowing as though focusing on a target not in the room. "I understand," he said at last. Another pause. "We will be ready." He ended the call and set the phone down with care, almost as if the weight of it had shifted. When he looked back at Alyssa, there was no softness left in his expression. "We need to prepare," he said. The room seemed to hold its breath. And somewhere beyond the doorway, just out of sight, Tiana stood in the shadow of the hallway. Her back pressed lightly against the wall. She had heard every word. Her eyes were fixed on the narrow opening into the dining room, her mind already racing ahead. They had switched places before, but never to survive. When they were children, Alyssa and Tiana Grant had used their identical faces as a harmless game, trading seats in class to confuse substitute teachers, swapping jackets at family gatherings to trick distant relatives. Those games always ended in laughter, their mother shaking her head while their father looked on with the faintest trace of approval. Now, in the dim light of early morning, the ritual returned stripped of playfulness. Tiana stood before the hallway mirror, fastening the strap of Alyssa's watch around her own wrist. The metal felt cool against her skin, the familiar weight strangely foreign. On the dresser beside her, Alyssa's school ID lay next to a neatly folded cardigan. Alyssa watched from the bed, her arms crossed. The faint red marks on her wrists were now fading to a muted brown, but she still held her hands in her lap as if guarding them. "You do not have to do this," Alyssa said. Her voice was steady, but there was a tension underneath, like a rope drawn taut. Tiana met her gaze in the mirror. "Yes, I do. You cannot walk into that building tomorrow and pretend nothing happened. They will be waiting. If you want to understand what we are dealing with, you need to watch from the outside." Her tone was not defiant. It was resolute. Marcus entered the room without knocking, carrying a small black case. He set it on the desk and opened it to reveal a row of objects. None of them weapons in the traditional sense, but each one purposeful. A folded campus map with handwritten marks in red ink. A small audio recorder disguised as a pen. A plain silver hair clip with an edge just sharp enough to slice through tape or twine. "Memorize the routes," Marcus said, placing the map in front of Tiana. "Every camera position, every blind corner, every exit that can be reached in under 30 seconds. By." Tiana studied it, tracing each line with her fingertip. "And the rules?" Marcus's eyes held hers. "You defend yourself only if attacked. No escalation, no threats. Every move you make must be something a teacher or student could explain away. If they push you, you step back. If they strike, you end it quickly and without spectacle." Alyssa shifted on the bed, her gaze moving between them. She knew the unspoken reason for those rules. If Tiana crossed a line, the truth they needed could be drowned in accusations of violence. "What if they figure it out?" Alyssa asked. "They will not," Tiana replied. She picked up the cardigan and slipped it on, adjusting the collar until it matched the way Alyssa wore it. "I know your walk, your handwriting, the way you look at the floor when you do not want to answer a question. I know when you breathe in before speaking and when you do not." Marcus closed the case and locked it. "You go in as Alyssa. You come out with what we need to expose them. Every word you hear, every look you see, remember it." For a moment, the room fell into silence. The early light from the window spilled across the floor, pooling around the three of them. The air felt heavier than it should, as though the walls themselves understood the weight of what was being decided. Finally, Tiana turned to her sister. "When this is over, they will not know which of us stood in front of them today. They will only remember what we did next." Alyssa rose and stepped closer, reaching out to adjust a strand of Tiana's hair so it fell the way hers did. The gesture was small, but it sealed the moment. The morning passed in measured steps. Marcus drove them to the edge of campus, the tires crunching over frost-hardened gravel. They parked in the lot behind the old community library, out of sight from the main road. "This is where you get out," Marcus said. Tiana opened the door, the cold air biting her cheeks. She adjusted the strap of Alyssa's bag on her shoulder, feeling its unfamiliar weight. Alyssa reached forward from the back seat, her hand resting briefly on her twin's arm. No words passed between them. There was nothing left to say that had not already been understood. Tiana walked the rest of the way. The sidewalk curved toward the front of Riverton High, where the brick facade caught the pale winter sun. Students milled about near the steps, their laughter and shouts rising into the air in uneven bursts. She slowed her pace just enough to project the right image, shoulders slightly rounded, eyes lowered, movement small. Anyone watching would see a girl returning to school after an unpleasant incident, careful not to draw attention. But behind her lowered gaze, her eyes were sharp, scanning every face, every gesture. She marked the clusters of students who turned away too quickly, the ones who leaned in to whisper as she passed. The front doors loomed ahead, their glass panes reflecting the gray-blue sky. Tiana reached for the handle, pausing for half a second as her reflection stared back at her. Not Tiana, but Alyssa. When she pushed the door open, the warm air of the hallway swept over her. She stepped inside with the posture of someone bracing for the day's wait, her expression measured, her pace deliberate. And though she moved like the quieter sister, her eyes carried the glint of something else entirely, cold, focused, and unafraid. The first bell had not yet rung, and already the halls of Riverton High were in motion, voices echoing off the painted cinder-block walls, lockers clanging open and shut, the dull thump of textbooks sliding onto metal shelves. Tiana moved through it all with measured steps, the strap of Alyssa's bag resting lightly on her shoulder. Her head tilted down just enough to give the impression of caution, but her eyes were alive, sweeping the corridors in slow, deliberate arcs. Every hallway was a corridor of information. She counted the security cameras first. A small black dome tucked above the library door. A lens mounted high in the corner by the stairwell, its red light blinking faintly. Another above the east exit, where the glass reflected the low winter sun. She noted which cameras were fixed and which could swivel, marking blind spots in her mind like empty squares on a chessboard. The faculty moved differently. Some walked with purpose, papers clutched to their chests, their gazes fixed straight ahead. Others lingered in doorways, scanning the crowd with eyes that pretended to be casual but avoided certain students entirely. Near the science wing, a teacher in a brown cardigan looked up just as Tiana passed, then quickly turned to speak to a colleague, his voice pitched low. She caught only fragments, still no report, best not to get involved, before they both moved inside and shut the door. Tiana kept walking, her expression unchanged. She had learned early from her father that the most valuable map was not drawn on paper. It lived in the rhythms of people, their hesitations, their alliances, their silences. By mid-morning, she had begun sketching that invisible map in her mind. At the center of it was Chase Whitmore. His presence was felt even when he was not in the hallway. Conversations slowed when he entered a room. Eyes followed him with a mix of wariness and deference. To his right in this hierarchy stood Madeline Ashford, the principal's daughter, whose reach extended beyond cheerleading into the subtle architecture of social life. She controlled the flow of information. Who was invited, who was excluded, whose mistakes were magnified. Brett Langston anchored the third point of this triangle. His family's ownership of key properties in town gave him a kind of immunity. He spoke less than the others, but when he did, his words traveled fast. Around them clustered smaller satellites, athletes who owed Chase favors, students who benefited from Madeline's approval, quiet enforcers who handled the work that could not be traced back to any one person, teachers whose careers depended on staying in the principal's good graces, floated on the outer ring of this constellation, orbiting power without ever touching its center. The map was not static. It shifted with each glance exchanged, each group that dissolved when she approached. In the cafeteria, she noticed how certain tables formed an unbroken chain of eyes from one side of the room to the other. No word or movement went unnoticed. Near the gym, two older students leaned against the wall, their bodies angled to block a smaller boy's path, until he muttered an apology and retreated. It was in the library that she saw him for the first time that day, Eric Daniels. He sat alone at a table near the back, a textbook open but unread in front of him. His posture was relaxed, almost indifferent, yet there was a precision to the way his fingers tapped lightly against the cover. He had the look of someone who had learned to take up just enough space to be overlooked. Tiana walked past without slowing, but her eyes caught his for the briefest moment. There was recognition there, not of her, but of something in her stance. Later, in history class, fate placed her 2 seats away from him. The teacher droned about colonial trade routes, his voice a steady monotone. Tiana took careful notes, not because she needed them, but because the act made her invisible. From the corner of her vision, she watched Eric. He did not look at her directly, but his pencil never stopped moving, sketching something on a loose sheet of paper. When the teacher turned to write on the board, Eric's hand slid across the gap between their desks. A folded piece of paper appeared on the edge of her notebook. For a moment, she did not move. Then, without glancing down, she shifted her arm to cover it and pulled the paper beneath her sleeve. The rest of the lesson passed in slow increments, each tick of the wall clock pulling her toward the inevitable. When the bell finally rang, the room erupted in the rustle of papers and scraping of chairs. Tiana waited until the aisle was clear, then opened the note under the shelter of her bag. The handwriting was small, the message simple: "Meet me after school." Her eyes lingered on the final word. The ink pressed deeper there, as if written with deliberate weight. She folded the paper once, twice, and slipped it into her pocket. Outside the window, the pale light of afternoon had begun to fade, and the corridors filled again with the restless movement of students. Somewhere within that shifting current, the map of Riverton was waiting to be redrawn, this time with her at its center. The final bell of the day rang, a hollow sound that rolled down the corridors and sent the tide of students spilling into the open air. Tiana waited until the stream thinned, then slipped from her seat and moved toward the back exit of the history wing. Eric was already there, leaning against the frame of a side door. His posture was casual, but his eyes scanned the hallway in quick, practiced arcs. Without a word, he pushed the door open and stepped into the dim, narrow stairwell. She followed. The heavy door shut behind them, muting the outside world into a distant hum. The stairs descended farther than she expected, the air cooling with each step. At the bottom, Eric produced a key from his pocket and unlocked a metal door with paint flaking at the edges. "This used to be the media storage room," he said, his voice low but steady. "No one comes down here since they built the new computer lab." The hinges groaned as the door swung open. Inside, dust hung in the air, catching the pale light from a single bare bulb. Metal shelves lined the walls, stacked with outdated monitors, coiled cables, and cardboard boxes marked with fading labels. In the center stood an old desk, its surface crowded with a battered laptop, a set of headphones, and a small portable speaker. Eric crossed the room, booted the laptop, and opened a folder without hesitation. The screen flickered, then resolved into a grainy video. "This," he said, pressing play, "happened last spring." The footage was shaky, recorded from a phone. It showed the school gym, empty except for 4 figures. A boy, smaller than the rest, stood with his back to the wall, his hands raised slightly in front of him. 3 older students formed a half circle, closing in. Tiana recognized the stance, the calculated spacing. One blocked the nearest exit, another moved just enough to obscure the camera's view of the boy's feet. The third spoke, his mouth twisting into a grin that did not reach his eyes. The audio was muffled, but the intention was clear. A shove. A stumble. Laughter. The boy's shoulder hit the wall, his head snapping back. The camera jolted and cut off. Tiana felt the stillness settle deeper into her chest. It was not the shock of seeing violence, she had known it happened. It was the precision. The same choreography she had faced in the gym only days ago. Eric closed the video and opened another file. This time, there was no image, only sound. At first it was background noise. Footsteps on tile, the distant slam of a locker. Then a voice, male, low, and deliberate. "Get rid of Baby Grant forever." The words were in English until the name, which was spoken with such sharp clarity that it felt cut from the air. Tiana's hand curled slightly against her thigh. "Where did you get this?" "Near the west stairwell," Eric replied. "They thought no one was around. I keep the recorder with me for reasons like this." The recording ended with a door closing and a rush of static. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet in the room seemed heavier than before. "They will not stop," Eric said finally. "Not unless someone makes them." Tiana met his gaze. "Then we make them." They left the basement in silence, retracing their steps through the stairwell. When they emerged into the fading light of afternoon, the school grounds were nearly empty. Across campus, Alyssa was alone in the gym. The vast room seemed larger without the noise of a crowd. The ropes still hung from the rafters, swaying faintly in the draft from the heating vents. She stood beneath the one where it had happened, her head tilted back, eyes tracing the length of coarse fiber up to the steel beam above. Her wrist still bore the faint shadow of the rope burn. She turned them over in the light, the skin a reminder of how quickly control could be stolen and taken back. The silence pressed close, broken only by the creak of the rafters. She reached out, fingers brushing the rope. Its texture was rough, unyielding. She closed her hand around it for a brief second, then let it go. Somewhere above, near the far corner of the gym, a crackle sounded. The old PA system, long unused during regular hours, hissed to life. Static gave way to a voice. Low. Male. Get rid of baby Grant forever. The words seemed to hang in the air long after the speaker clicked off, leaving only the empty hiss. Alyssa stood very still, and in that stillness, the truth settled into her like a weight she could not yet measure. The morning air in the corridors carried a brittle edge, as if the winter outside had found its way through the brick walls. Students moved in clumps, their conversations a low, constant murmur. Tiana, in Alyssa's place, walked with the same measured caution as before, shoulders drawn in slightly, her eyes lowered enough to seem guarded, but never so much that she could not see the corners of the hall. Every face she passed was a note in the mental map she had been building, every whisper a small pin in the pattern of power. At the far end of the main hall, Chase Whitmore stood near the trophy case. His posture was casual, one hand in the pocket of his varsity jacket, the other resting on the glass, but there was an intent focus in his gaze. When he saw her, he straightened and began walking toward her with the slow, unhurried steps of someone who expected the path to clear. And it did. Tough week, he said when they were within arm's reach. His voice was calm, the faintest curve of a smile at the edges, but the smile did not reach his eyes. I wanted to check in. Tiana met his look, holding it just long enough to signal neither fear nor challenge. I am fine. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. You know, people here, they talk. Sometimes they get the wrong idea. I like to make sure the story is accurate. Ah. She let the silence stretch, sensing that he wanted her to fill it. She did not. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, the friendly facade tightening. If you ever need to clarify anything, you should come to me. Saves a lot of trouble. Tiana nodded once, the movement small. I will keep that in mind. He studied her for a moment longer, then stepped aside to let her pass. She walked on without looking back, but she felt his gaze on her until the corner turned. By late morning, the hall outside the faculty lounge was nearly empty. Tiana had passed it many times, noting the comings and goings of teachers. One face she had begun to trust, Mr. Halpern, a social studies teacher who had shown quiet solidarity with Miss Coleman during an earlier staff meeting, nodding along when she challenged an unfair grading policy. Today, his voice drifted into the hallway as the lounge door stood slightly ajar. She is already on thin ice, he was saying. It would not take much to make the adjustment seem justified. Tiana's steps slowed. Another voice joined in, Madeline Ashford. My father just needs the paperwork to align with her behavior. If we frame it as ongoing disruption, the board will sign off without a second glance. The words were sharp, deliberate, wrapped in the polished tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Mr. Halpern replied, his voice lower now, but still audible. Leave the phrasing to me. Attendance discrepancies, minor disciplinary notes, nothing that will stand out until it is too late. Tiana's pulse steadied, her breath quiet. The conversation was not about some hypothetical student. It was about Alyssa, about her. Without moving into view, she slid her hand into her bag and pressed the small recorder pen Marcus had given her. The soft click was inaudible beneath Madeline's next sentence. Good. Once it is on record, even her mother will not be able to contest it. She will have to leave quietly. Silence followed for a few seconds, broken by the clink of a mug being set down. Then Mr. Halpern again, his tone almost casual. Consider it done. Footsteps began moving toward the door. Tiana withdrew into the recessed doorway of the storage closet across the hall, pulling the door nearly shut. She held her breath as Madeline's heels clicked past, followed by the quieter tread of Mr. Halpern's shoes. Neither glanced toward her hiding place. When the sound of their steps faded, she emerged, crossing the hall quickly. The lounge door was still ajar, the faint aroma of coffee lingering. She resisted the urge to step inside. No need to risk discovery now. She had what she needed. Her fingers closed around the recorder in her bag. The weight of it was nothing, but the gravity of what it held was immense. By the final period, her thoughts were a taut wire. She moved through the motions of class, opening her notebook, writing when required, but her mind replayed the conversation in precise detail. The betrayal was not only in the content of their words, but in the mask that Mr. Halpern had worn before. She had wanted to believe his nods to Miss Coleman had meant something, that his silence in the face of injustice was reluctance, not complicity. Now she knew better. The last bell released the students into the fading light of afternoon. Tiana walked toward the side exit, the corridor narrowing as lockers gave way to brick walls. She slipped outside, the cold air filling her lungs, and only then allowed herself to press the playback button. The voices were as clear as they had been in the lounge. Attendance, discrepancies, minor disciplinary notes. She will have to leave quietly. The pen clicked off, and the street was suddenly too quiet. She closed her hand around the recorder, feeling the hard edge of it against her palm. This was no longer just about observation or mapping the territory. The lines had been drawn, and the evidence was now in her possession. Somewhere in the distance, the wind shifted, carrying with it the muffled sound of laughter from students heading home. It was an ordinary sound, and yet it sharpened her resolve. The recording was hers now, and soon it would be theirs to answer for. The rain had stopped by late afternoon, but the streets still glistened like strips of black glass, reflecting the bruised colors of the sky. Tiana sat alone in the corner booth of the small coffee shop near the edge of town. The hum of the espresso machine was a quiet backdrop to her thoughts, but her focus was far from the steam and the hiss. She kept glancing at the door, waiting. When Eric finally walked in, he looked older than she remembered, as if the weight of what he carried had bent him forward. His hoodie was damp at the edges, his hair falling into his eyes. He hesitated at the threshold, scanning the room, before spotting her. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Acknowledgement, maybe even guilt. He slid into the seat opposite her without ordering anything. For a moment, they just sat in silence. Tiana's fingers traced the rim of her cup. She knew better than to rush him. "I almost did not come," Eric said finally, his voice low but steady. "I told myself I owed you the truth, but the truth is heavy. Once it is spoken, you cannot take it back." Tiana met his gaze, then say it. He looked away, eyes fixed on the rain streaks sliding down the window. It was 3 years ago, 7th grade. "Marcus, do you remember him?" His voice faltered on the name. He was the new kid, tall, awkward. He had this way of looking at people like he expected them to be kind. But in this town, Eric let the sentence hang in the air. Tiana did remember. Marcus had lasted only a few months before vanishing without explanation. Rumors filled the vacuum. Some said his family moved for work. Others whispered it had to do with debts. But no one ever knew for sure. "I was there," Eric continued, "the day they cornered him behind the gym. 4 of them. They pushed him down, tore his backpack apart, dumped everything into the mud. They called him names I do not want to repeat. I could have stepped in. I could have at least yelled. But I did nothing." His hands curled into fists on the table. "Do you know what is worse than fear? Relief. I was relieved they were not doing it to me. I stood there and felt relief, and that relief is something I have hated myself for every day since." The words seemed to drain him. He leaned back, eyes glassy, and took a slow breath before going on. "It did not stop there. His father lost work at the mill. People said it was because of a cutback, but my uncle told me the truth. Mr. Dawson was blacklisted. The people who run things here made sure he could not get hired anywhere in town. They had influence, and they used it. The Dawsons had to leave, no choice. They sold their house for almost nothing." Tiana felt her stomach twist. This was not just about playground cruelty. This was about power wielded in the shadows, the kind that left no fingerprints but destroyed lives all the same. Eric's voice hardened. "I carried that silence like a stone in my chest. Every time I saw you stand up to them, every time you refused to back down, I felt the weight of what I failed to do. That is why I am here. I want to help you. I want to make it right." She studied him, searching for any trace of self-preservation in his eyes, but found only weariness and a raw kind of sincerity. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I see the same signs," he said. "The same people pulling the same strings, and if we do not stop them this time, another Marcus will happen. Another family will vanish, and everyone will pretend it was their own fault." Outside, the light was fading, the sky slipping into a deep indigo. Street lamps blinked awake one by one, throwing halos into the mist. Inside the coffee shop, the air felt still, as if the entire room had leaned in to hear what came next. Tiana set her cup down slowly. "You know, once we start, there is no undoing it." "I know," he said, "and I am ready." She thought of the recording in her bag, the teacher's voice colluding with Madeline, proof that the rot was deeper than anyone wanted to admit. She thought of Marcus's vanished smile, of the countless moments when silence had been the safe choice, and how it had always come at someone else's expense. She took out her phone. Her fingers hovered for a moment, then moved with certainty. She found Alyssa's name and typed two words that felt like striking a match in the dark. It is time. The message sent, and for the first time in hours, Tiana allowed herself a thin, grim smile. Whatever came next, there would be no turning back. The note arrived in the middle of third period, folded into a perfect square and slipped onto Tiana's desk by a silent student aide. It bore only 6 words in neat block letters. Report to Principal Ashford's office immediately. She read it twice, the paper trembling slightly between her fingers. The words could have been a summons, a warning, or a promise. She could not yet tell. But she knew one thing. In this building, an invitation to that office often meant walking into a carefully prepared snare. The hallway stretched before her like a narrow throat. Her footsteps echoed against the linoleum, too loud, as if the school itself wanted to announce her approach. She thought of Eric's confession the day before, the way his voice had cracked when he spoke of standing by in silence while her friend was dragged down. She thought of the family forced to leave town, their windows boarded over, their mailbox removed, as though erasing their existence would erase the guilt of the people who had driven them out. And she thought of Alyssa's message, still glowing on her phone. If you go in, be ready. The principal's office door was half open. Beyond it, Principal Ashford sat at his desk, head bent over a single sheet of paper, his pen poised as if waiting for her. His suit was immaculate, the tie a precise knot of deep blue. There was no warmth in his eyes when he looked up. Tiana, he said, though the name came with a slight hesitation, as if trying it on. Please, come in, close the door. She stepped inside, letting the door click softly shut. The air smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. On the desk lay a document, already turned toward her. Its lines of text, sharp in the lamplight. It is a simple acknowledgement of responsibility, Ashford said, tapping the page. You sign, and the matter is closed. No suspension, no permanent record. You return to class and continue your education without interruption. Her gaze slid over the lines, catching words like admission, misconduct, physical altercation. It was a trap woven out of bureaucracy, one signature, and the truth would vanish beneath the ink of her own name. Why me? She asked softly, keeping her voice level. Why not speak to Alyssa directly? His eyes narrowed. You are here because it is in everyone's interest to resolve this quietly. Sometimes it is better not to involve others. Tiana reached into her backpack, withdrawing a folder and laying it casually on her lap. Inside, her phone was recording, its red light hidden by the paper's edge. She had set it moments before entering, just as Alyssa had advised. But she wanted more than audio. She wanted a witness. I am not sure I understand, she said, tilting her head. Perhaps Miss Coleman could clarify? It was a gamble, invoking the name of the English teacher who had once spoken cautiously against the administration's handling of harassment cases. And then, by chance, or perhaps something more, there was a knock on the door. Miss Coleman's voice floated in, hesitant. You asked to see me, Principal Ashford? Ashford stiffened, caught in the unexpected presence. Yes, come in, you might as well hear this. The conversation resumed, but now there was a new weight in the room. Ashford's words grew slower, more careful. Yet he could not erase what had already been implied, the offer of clemency in exchange for a public lie. Tiana leaned forward, placing the document back on his desk, but keeping her hand on it, as if to steady herself. If I sign this, she said, the real aggressors walk free, and the next time they do this to someone else, you will be able to say the case was handled. Is that the outcome you want recorded, Principal Ashford? The silence after her question was the kind that burns. Miss Coleman's eyes moved from Tiana to Ashford and back, her brow furrowed. Ashford reached for his pen again, but not to write. He spun it slowly between his fingers. You have changed, he said at last, his tone carrying something between accusation and unease. This is not the Alyssa I remember. Tiana met his gaze without flinching. No, she said, it is not. The words hung there, heavy, as if marking the moment when the balance shifted. The phone in her folder captured every syllable. Miss? Coleman's quiet breathing filled the space where Ashford's authority used to be unchallenged. Outside the office, the bell rang, a shrill reminder that the rest of the school was moving forward, unaware that a line had just been drawn here, in polished wood and shadow. Tiana rose, leaving the unsigned paper between them like an accusation. She turned toward the door, her fingers brushing the strap of her backpack where the recording waited to be sent. Her pulse quickened, not with fear but with resolve, because she knew what would happen next. Somewhere down the hall, her phone would vibrate with a single message to Alyssa. It is time. The late afternoon sun lay low over Brookstone, staining the glass windows of the school in golden shadow. The air was heavy, as though the day itself was holding its breath. Tiana stepped into the main hall and froze. A man she recognized only from whispered warnings stood near the front office, hands clasped behind his back, a faint smile stretching thin across his face. Harold Sterling, councilman, parent of influence. The name had floated through Part 5 like a drifting shadow, overheard in murmured complaints, in the clipped tones of parents who spoke of keeping things in order. Now he was here, in the flesh, wearing a tailored suit that looked pressed by the weight of authority itself. Tiana Grant, he said, pronouncing each syllable with deliberate care, as though reminding her who she was and who he was not. I was hoping to catch you before you left. And the way he looked at her made it clear this was no casual meeting. This was a summons, delivered in the middle of an open hallway so she could not refuse without making a scene. She followed him into an empty conference room, the blinds half drawn, casting stripes of light across the table. He did not sit. I am here on behalf of several concerned families, he began, his voice smooth but edged with something colder. There is unrest over the recent incident. The smart move, for everyone involved, is to let the matter rest. Withdraw your complaints. Avoid unnecessary attention. Tiana's hands tightened into fists at her sides. You mean pretend it never happened? I mean, Sterling replied, taking a slow step closer. Protect your family. The court of public opinion can be unforgiving. The unspoken threat settled like ice in the air. She thought of her father's long hours at the hospital, her mother's quiet strength, Eric's proud, anxious face when he talked about his scholarship. Sterling's smile thinned. I suggest you speak with your parents tonight. If they agree, this will all fade away. No further damage, no further complications. And then, without another word, he left, his footsteps precise, as though he had already decided the outcome. By the next morning, the storm broke. A video, grainy, edited with surgical precision, spread across social media. It showed fragments of the cafeteria confrontation, but not the truth. Gone were the insults, the provocation, the moment that forced Tiana to defend herself. In its place was a clipped, damning scene. Alyssa's face twisted in defiance. A sudden movement, the sound of impact. No context, no justice. The caption read, Unprovoked attack on student, violence in our schools. Within hours, comment sections roared. Parents reposted the clip with words like dangerous and out of control. Students whispered in hallways. The tide that once swelled in her favor turned cold. By noon, Alyssa was suspended, effective immediately. Her mother's voice had been tight over the phone, balancing fury and fear. Eric came to her locker looking pale, clutching a letter from the scholarship committee. They said they are reviewing my application, he said, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. Sterling's friends are on the board. If they pull it, his voice trailed off, the weight of it pressing between them. Tiana felt the walls closing in. Every choice, every small victory they had fought for, was being undone by unseen hands. That evening, she sat in the kitchen with her parents. The silence between them stretched thin. Her mother held the printed email from Sterling in one hand, the other tapping against the table. This is not just about you, her father said, his voice low, almost pleading. If we keep pushing, they will come after Eric, after all of us. Tiana's gaze dropped to her lap. She could still feel the heat of Sterling's presence in that dim room, the calculated certainty of his threat. For a moment, she wondered if this fight had already been lost before it began. But then Miss Coleman's words from the principal's office replayed in her mind. They win when you are silent. The next day at school was worse. Teachers glanced away when she entered the room. Classmates shifted in their seats. Even those who had once nodded in quiet solidarity now avoided her eyes. The video had done its work. By the final bell, she was walking through the near-empty parking lot, the sound of her footsteps echoing against the fading light. She could feel the burn of eyes on her from somewhere unseen. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, She pulled it out and froze. A message. No sender name. Just 7 words, stark and sharp against the screen. You will be the next one. The wind swept across the lot, carrying with it the low hum of streetlights and the faint taste of rain. She stood there, alone in the wide expanse, the message burning in her hand, knowing that whatever came next would demand more than courage. It would demand everything she had left. The next morning, the air inside the Grant household felt like it was holding its breath. The curtains were drawn tight against the pale light, as if to keep the outside world from pressing in too soon. Tiana sat at the kitchen table, untouched tea cooling in her hands, the events of the night before looping in her mind like a reel that refused to end. Harold Sterling's words still echoed, soft-spoken but lined with iron, and the anonymous message from the parking lot still burned cold in her chest. Across from her, Alyssa and Marcus leaned close over Marcus's laptop. Their faces were set in that unyielding focus that comes only when there is no other choice. On the screen, the file they had been working on all night loaded in its full clarity, the uncut video of the incident, coupled with the complete, unaltered audio. Once this is out, there is no turning back, Marcus murmured, his voice low but steady. We crossed that line a long time ago, Alyssa replied, not looking up. Her eyes glinted with something sharp, a mixture of exhaustion, fury, and resolve. They had scrubbed the footage clean of the distortions and cuts introduced by whoever had tried to frame them. The original recording, now synchronized with audio captured by Alyssa's phone, revealed every detail, the shove, the slur, the look in Chase's eyes that spoke of intent. It was more than proof. It was truth in its rawest form. But truth, Marcus knew, could be dangerous. By mid-morning, their plan was set. Marcus had already contacted Evan Reeves, a local journalist with a reputation for exposing corruption despite the threats that followed him. Alyssa would send the file directly, along with a written timeline of events. At the same time, the video would be shared with a private group of parents, people who had grown disillusioned with the school's closed-door handling of repeated complaints. The clock on the wall ticked past 10 in the morning as Alyssa hit send. Somewhere in town, phones began to buzz. By early afternoon, the footage had begun its climb through the undercurrents of social media. It was not trending yet, but every share carried weight. It appeared first in parent group chats, then in local community boards, and finally on Evan Reeves's online column. His headline was stripped of embellishment. Unedited video reveals full scope of school incident. The effect was immediate. Parents began calling the district office. Teachers exchanged guarded glances in hallways. Students whispered between classes, passing phones under desks, each replay tightening the coil of pressure around the administration. And then came the shift. By evening, larger accounts began to pick it up. A civil rights advocacy group reposted the footage with a statement demanding accountability. A retired police captain from the neighboring county weighed in publicly, calling for an independent review. Inside the police station, the pressure became unavoidable. By nightfall, the department announced a preliminary inquiry, citing public concern and emerging evidence. The next day was chaos at the school. Chase and his 2 closest accomplices were called from class before the first bell had even faded. The sight of them walking down the hallway, flanked by 2 administrators, set off a wave of murmurs. Their expressions were a mixture of arrogance and unease, as though they could not decide whether to laugh or to brace for impact. By midday, the announcement came over the intercom. They were suspended pending investigation. Principal Ashford did not fare much better. Before lunch, she was escorted from the building, not by security, but by 2 members of the school board. The official term was administrative leave. To the watching students, it looked like exile. Tiana saw it all from the edge of the main hall. The victory felt strange in her chest, too quick, too sudden, as if the ground beneath it had not yet settled. She found Alyssa near the library, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "It is happening," Alyssa whispered. But there was no smile, only the taut awareness that nothing was truly over. Late that night, the television flickered in the Grant living room. The local channel had cut into its regular program for a breaking news interview. Harold Sterling sat in the studio, framed by the soft light of practiced authority. His suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly centered, the image of a man untouchable. When the anchor asked about the circulating footage, Sterling's lips curved into a polite, cold smile. "I have seen the so-called evidence," he said, voice smooth as glass. "And I can tell you, This is a deliberate attempt to smear reputations and divide our community. People should think very carefully before believing everything they see on the internet. No tremor touched his voice. No sign betrayed that he had been cornered. Instead, his composure suggested a man who had already calculated the next move. The camera lingered on that smile for a beat too long before the feed cut back to the anchor. In the dim light of the living room, Tiana stared at the screen. The victory of the day felt as fragile as glass in her hands, and somewhere deep inside, she knew Sterling had just placed his fingers on the first crack. The air in the auditorium was heavy, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath. Rows of folding chairs stood in perfect lines, every one of them occupied by a parent, teacher, or student who had stayed after school for the emergency meeting. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, their pale glow washing over faces that bore equal parts fatigue and defiance. Alyssa sat in the second row, hands clasped in her lap. She could feel the pulse in her fingertips. Marcus was 2 seats away, his gaze fixed on the elevated platform where the school board members shuffled their notes. Sterling sat at the center of the table, his posture as precise as the knot in his tie. The first to speak was a mother with silver-streaked hair, her voice trembling at first, then sharpening like steel. "We are here because our children deserve safety without politics. We are here because we have seen the proof. We demand independent oversight." "I don't." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. A father in the back stood next, his presence towering even without the microphone. "If a principal can dismiss evidence, if a coach can act without consequence, if students can be targeted without protection, then the system is broken. We will not leave it in your hands alone." Alyssa watched Sterling's face, not a twitch. His expression was the same mask he had worn during every denial, every sidestep. Only his eyes moved, scanning the crowd, calculating. One by one, parents took the microphone. A retired officer spoke about integrity. A nurse spoke about scars that do not show. A young father described his son's sudden fear of walking the halls. Each voice added another layer to the weight pressing on the board's table. When the chairperson finally spoke, her tone was careful, as though balancing on a narrow beam. "An independent oversight committee will be appointed, Mr. Sterling will remain in his position during the process, but a formal investigation into potential conflicts of interest will begin immediately." The applause was subdued, more acknowledgement than celebration. Alyssa's stomach tightened. Sterling had not fallen, but the ground beneath him had shifted. She caught the faintest movement from him, a slow exhale, a barely, their smirk at the corner of his mouth. A week later, the corridors smelled faintly of wax and floor cleaner. Alyssa stepped inside for the first time since the suspension ended. The light disciplinary mark on her record was still there, a reminder in black ink that the truth had not cleared her entirely. Yet the whispers that once followed her had softened, some replaced by silent nods from students who had seen the video, others by averted eyes from those still unsure. Miss Coleman was not in her usual classroom. Alyssa learned through murmurs that she had been reassigned to another grade level. No announcement, no explanation, just an absence where her sharp voice used to echo. Tiana met Alyssa outside the gym that afternoon. In her hands was a folded strip of fabric, deep crimson, its edges frayed like it had waited for this moment too long. Alyssa understood immediately. The gym was empty, the echo of their footsteps traveling high into the rafters. The climbing ropes swayed slightly in the draft from the vents, their fibers worn from years of hands pulling upward. Alyssa looked at them, remembering how it had all begun. One rope, one challenge, one moment when the world had chosen to watch or to turn away. Without a word, Tiana held the ladder steady as Alyssa climbed. The metal was cool under her palms. When she reached the crossbeam near the rafters, she tied the fabric so it hung just above the ropes, the letters bold and unflinching. "Courage does not need witnesses." For a long moment, she stayed there, her fingers resting on the knot. The gym was silent except for the soft creak of the ropes. From below, Tiana's voice carried upward. "It will stay as long as they let it." Alyssa climbed down slowly. She knew the banner might be taken down by morning, perhaps even before the next practice. But the rafters would remember. The ropes would remember. As they stepped outside, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the pavement. Alyssa felt the weight in her chest ease, not because the battle was over, but because she had left something behind that no one could erase completely. Some victories were loud, broadcast in headlines, and shared in millions of clicks. Others lived quietly in the places where they were planted, waiting for the right hands to find them. She looked back once at the gym doors. Some knots take time to loosen, she thought. Some ropes need time before they break. And she knew this was not an ending, but a beginning with edges still sharp. The rafters of that old gym had seen countless games, forgotten trophies, and echoes of cheers that had long since faded into the dust. But now they held something else, a strip of cloth bearing 7 words. Courage does not need witnesses. It was a message that did not shout, but stood tall, the way a flame holds its shape in still air. For Alyssa and Tiana, hanging that banner was not a final act of victory. It was a reminder, a promise, and a challenge all at once. This story began with silence, forced silence, the kind pressed on someone's spirit by fear, by tradition, and by the unseen chains of power. Alyssa's first days in this town had been a storm without warning. Whispers followed her in the hallways, shadows lengthened in the cafeteria, and cruelty wore the mask of a smile. At first, she tried to survive by staying small, as if the walls could shield her from what she could not yet face. But the truth is, the walls of injustice are never as solid as they appear. They crack when enough hands push together. They shake when enough voices choose to speak. And so the tide began to turn, not with a single act, but with many. A moment of self-defense, a choice to keep the camera rolling, a decision to share the truth, even when the cost was uncertain. The evidence that Alyssa and Marcus carried into the world was not just a video file. It was a key that unlocked the doors the powerful had tried to keep sealed. Parents saw what had been hidden. Neighbors questioned what they had been told. The quiet corners of the internet lit up with debates and demands for change. It was not a perfect victory. Chase and his circle were suspended, yes, but the stain of what they had done could not be erased in a week or a month. Principal Ashford was placed on leave, but his shadow still lingered over the staff who had learned to look away. Sterling, with his polished words and a smile carved from ice, still stood in front of cameras, weaving doubt into the public air. And Alyssa? She returned to school with a file marked minor disciplinary action, an official record that told part of the truth, but never the whole of it. That was the way of such battles. Wins came mixed with wounds. Yet there was something different now. When she walked the halls, some students who once averted their eyes now nodded, quietly acknowledging what they had seen. A teacher who had once stood apart now lingered a moment longer to ask if she was doing all right. It was not sweeping change, but it was the beginning of a shift. The gym, once a place of drills and discipline, became something else that day they hung the banner. The cloth fluttered slightly in the warm air, and it caught the light in a way that seemed to pull every eye upward. Beneath it, the floor was scarred from years of use. That was fitting. True courage is never spotless. And if there is a lesson to carry from Alyssa's journey, it is this. Courage is not always about winning. More often, it is about showing up when the odds are set against you, when the crowd is silent, and when your voice shakes. It is about choosing to speak, even if you believe no one will listen, because somewhere, someone will. Injustice relies on shadows. It thrives when fear keeps people apart. But truth, once shared, has a way of multiplying. One witness becomes 2. 2 become 10. 10 become a movement. Perhaps you have seen moments like this in your own life, times when someone was treated unfairly and the room seemed to hold its breath. Perhaps you were that person, waiting for someone to step forward. Or perhaps you are the one deciding whether you would. The Rafters remember, even when the world moves on. They remember the nights when no one came to help. They remember the mornings when someone finally did. And if those beams could speak, they would tell you that every act of courage, no matter how small, leaves its mark. Alyssa's banner will not end the fight. Sterling will not crumble because of one meeting, and the deeper roots of prejudice will not vanish because one group of students stood their ground. But change rarely arrives all at once. It comes in ripples, in moments, in decisions made quietly and lived out loudly. If you take anything from her story, let it be this. You do not need the perfect stage or the perfect words to make a difference. You do not need a crowd to cheer you on. You need only to act when the moment calls for you, to push against the weight of silence, to keep the truth in the light, and to stand where it matters most. Perhaps today, the Rafters belong to a small-town gym. Tomorrow, they might belong to the roof beams of your workplace, your school, your home, and they will remember what you choose to do. Some battles will not end in applause. Some truths will not be met with gratitude. But if you keep going, if you refuse to bend to the easy way of looking away, you will be part of something larger than yourself. The banner above Alyssa's head will fade with time. The letters will soften, the edges will fray, but long after the cloth is gone, the idea will remain. Courage does not need witnesses. And maybe, somewhere down the line, someone will remember her story in a moment of their own and choose to stand. If this story has found a place in your thoughts, I invite you to share what it has stirred in you. Leave your reflections below, your own stories, your own moments of courage, your own battles fought in the quiet. And if you wish to walk with us through more journeys like this one, you can join by subscribing. Not for numbers, but to keep these stories alive, so that courage continues to find new voices, new rafters, and new witnesses, even when none are needed. Because some chords take time to break. But when they do, the sound carries far.